going to start recording now that you've all spoken. So in the future, if you speak, you will be recorded as part of the ongoing webinar, just so that you know. I really appreciate all your questions. From Felix is talking about positionality. Jeremy is the justification for principle of all principles. Matt, can the eidetic stand up without the transcendental? Bill Powers, the notion of intuition as a primordial experience, and how can he do that? Bill Adams, matter and psyche, what does founded mean? Gordon, the notion of the translation, particularly with respect to erkentness. Bruno, is there a systematic presentation rather than a showing? Sally, universality versus subjectivity. And Randy, the notion of methesis universalis and regional ontology. Now I'm reading those back to you to prove I wrote stuff down and that I listened to you. What I can't promise is that I will answer them satisfactorily to you in the course of this or any of the remaining 3 sessions that we have. What I can do is say, I'm prepared to offer you a reading of this book and of these sections, and to allow you to interact with that reading and with the book and with your questions over these 4 months, right? So I would, if I were you, I would write them down. I think that a webinar such as this, in the way that I've structured it, may actually be ultimately disappointing to some of you, or maybe all of you. So, for example, my stomach turns at the abstract moments of logical stuff that Husserl does, regional and methesis universe. I mean, it just doesn't get me. What gets me is the kind, and I'll say this in a minute, what I think is going on in his new description of consciousness as an event that's redrawing the boundaries of subjectivity and objectivity. So what I believe will happen is, if you afford me your patience as we go through, I believe that a good deal of the questions that you asked will receive some sort of treatment or answer. It may not be that all of them do, and it may be that the answer that I provide is not satisfactory to you. I think that's fine. That part of what this webinar is an attempt to study and talk together, and you don't have to wait until next time to interact with me outside of this either, and to get a finer point on your points. But I do think that what I have to offer is fairly non-standard with respect to who Husserl is. I think it's more like a Merleau-Pontian reading of Husserl. In fact, that's my whole shtick, is to read him that way. So just so you know. But I think many of you are Husserl scholars in your own right, and I know that we are a group, and yet we are also invested in our own readings. So I just ask that we let that simmer together as we go forward. But again, thank you very much for the questions and for the engagement. I will start with an overview of what I think I'm about to do, and that should give you some sort of point of reference as we then go together into the different groups of sections. So I see ideas 1 as describing, as I just said, the event of consciousness. And I'm using the event as a word to indicate things like Heidegger and Marion and Jean-Luc Nancy and all the people after Husserl who are really interested in givenness and the event. So I see him as saying that the intertwining of subject and object allows for the agency of the object to come up in a new way. The German word leibhaftig, and my German pronunciation is awful, and you'll see that, but the word leibhaftig literally means in the flesh, right? It has the word leib in it, which is our lived body. In the translation, it's in person. But I think that misses the idea that there is a life, there is a generativity, there is an agency to the thing. There's even an ownness, Eigenheit, an ownness to each thing, each object. And so that means that the event of consciousness is a responsiveness or a recognition that is mine to givenness as a kind of eruption of thing and me intertwined. So experience as such, and unfortunately in this translation, as many of you already know, the words mental process are the translator's rendering of Erlebnis, which is literally living through, right? It's a lived experience. So experience as Erlebnis is that which embraces us and things, and which we are in the midst of. So the clarification of consciousness as Erlebnis for Husserl is, I think, the clarification that we can stand neither on the side of consciousness nor on the side of the object, but that we are somehow poised between idealism and realism. So that means that givenness, Gebenheit, is introducing us to the structure of what is implicit in the explicit. And our role as descriptors, phenomenologists are descriptors of experience. And this is, Husserl has said this elsewhere, but not here, but I still think he means it here, is to extend givenness. Our participation in givenness by our means of description of what appears is to extend givenness into explicitude by our very act. So there are some key terms to think about as we go along. I admit I hadn't thought about erkenntnis, Gordon, but the ones that I think we should be thinking about is specifically with respect to translation are mental process or Erlebnis, or lived experience, the word presentive, which unfortunately is a translation of geben, giving, right? So when something is giving or given, and leibhaftig, or in person. What does it mean for a thing to present itself, to give itself in the flesh? The path we will look at is, number one, from givenness to eidetic intuition to science as an interplay of givenness, regional ontology, and description. That's the first chunk of numbers. Then to number two, the method of phenomenology as the description of objects of experience as given. That's 23 and 24. To number three, the identity of the natural attitude as the implicit stance of being lost in the world, and the role of phenomenology as an act of dissociation from lostness. That's going to be where the epoche comes in. To the description, number four, of consciousness itself in its purity as having an inherent relation to the world that consciousness, gears into. So that's how I would divide the four different sections, four different groups. So what I'm going to do is talk about 1, 3, 6, 9, and 17. I know lots of people were interested in 17, and then ask for discussion for 10 minutes or so, and where I'll be quiet and you can talk. And then move on to 23 and 24. That's where the principle of all principles is. Speak about that for a while. Again, pause for you to talk and challenge or support. Then there'll be a number of sections together: 27, 28, 33, 34, 35, 37, 38. So that'll be a longer section, and then break again, maybe for 15 minutes of discussion on your part, and then 41 and 42 if we have time, and then break again for the last time. So I can stay a little longer than 2 o'clock if you can, and I can, we'll see how it goes. But I do want to try, all of us, to get through the book in 4 months. So I'd like to see if we can make it. It's, it's difficult. It took him a number of years to write. Should take us a number of hours to read. Anyway, so let's start on chapter 1. And I have the German and the English in here. We can look at it together. So in section 1 of chapter 1, Husserl starts with world as a collective horizon. These are words on the page, right, on third line down. And with perception as giving intuition. World is at the bottom of the first paragraph. Everything real joins together to make up the unity of the world. So this implies that the interlocking character of things is their co-foundation with world. Foundation is not sufficiently the establishment of the possibility, conditions for the possibility of something, but you could start there with foundation. So I would just want you to note that he starts with world, and that's the interlocking of everything into its ground, and also its sort of like appearing. Perception is having something given as the possibility of focusing on it. Perception is not an act separate from the object that it somehow hooks up with. Perception is the having of the object as calling for and sustaining an intuition. So I'm still on page 5. If you look at the bottom, natural experience is presentive of something originarily. That's what perception is. An experience that is presentive of something originarily. The word presentive tries to translate the word gebende, giving. So givenness is something that we're about to look at. On page 6, the world is the sum total or total concept or grasp that we live, that we experience. And that's in the first full paragraph on the page, right in the middle of the page. Husserl says the world is the sum total. The German is actually Gesamtinbegriff, the total grasp or the total concept. So we see and experience the world as such, as the very interconnectedness of things. Things gear into one another as world. And we gear into the world too, as the co-founding of things in their meaningful description as both individual and as related. Now, I'm going to just keep moving on, and then at the end, we can talk. So let's look at section 3 on page 8. An intuition of the individual gets transmuted into eidetic seeing. That's in the first paragraph in the middle. The word transmuted there is umgewandelt. I'm going to point out that German word because variations of wandeln appear later in the way that things do or do not occur as a transformation. So in this sense, one of the issues of eidetic intuition, which is new, right, which Husserl is saying is its own act of quote unquote perceiving, one intuition somehow is transformed into the seeing of an essence. And I heard your questions like, how is that possible? And how does he make that claim? And is it a legitimate claim? If you look on page 9, this is not to clarify, but rather to point to where he's saying something similar. The perception of something individual, this is the first full paragraph on page 9, can be adequate or inadequate. It can take the turn into seeing an essence. It's a new kind of intuition that seems to happen as our perception, and yet there is a kind of passivity occurring. It takes a turn. It somehow is a transmuted. Givenness is, we have to wrestle with the fact that he is somewhere between active and passive with respect to all experience as such. So the essence is given. That means we can't exactly trace how it comes to be that I grasp the intuition directly. For it is not simply our doing, and yet we are participating in it, and it is our act of seeing. So it's as he says in the next paragraph, which is all in italics, it's a new sort of object. A new sort of object that announces itself as different from a perceived object. Now, you may think that these are all obvious things to say, and maybe, as I said, it may be inherently dissatisfactory. But I think if we go over what is obvious, that may spark all of us to think more deeply about these things. One thing that I thought about was that Husserl is claiming that essential intuition and its relation to essence in the next paragraph is a radical community, a radikale Gemeinsamkeit, a radical community. And I thought there's two kinds of radical community that he means here, even though he's only spelling out one. There's a radical community between the intuition and the essence, the object of the intuition, which belong together. That's a noetic and noematic claim that is anticipated here, but only becomes clear later. But there's also a radical community between, and he names that one below, relatively interrelated concepts, intuition and object. But there's another kind of community between the act of essential intuition and the act of perceiving. And that radical community is no longer a community of subject and object, but a community of two very specific, different, not completely isomorphic acts. So these acts must be different enough, perception and the perception of essences, let's call them. They must be different enough to mark themselves out as different, yet they must be essentially a community. The essence itself must be different enough from the act of seeing the essence to mark itself out, and yet not so different that they don't enter in community with one another. I think community is an important right translation of this. I think there's something that we could spin off as we continue about how human community, for example, might rest on the kind of community that we experience between our acts of intuition, which are different, and our act and our object. Husserl is claiming that essential intuition is verifiable in our own experience. And this is on page 10. He says the essence is itself given. And when he says it's self-given, it is selbst gegeben. Maybe a person who's more finely attuned to German could say this or not, but it seems to me to imply there's an agency, a self-giving character, not simply self-given, but self-given, as a peculiar mode of giving itself. It is a mode of givenness that traces its originality from a perceptual object, namely the essence, tracing its originality as individual. Our intuition can recognize the essence in its personal selfhood. That's in the middle of that broken paragraph at the top. And that personal selfhood is what translates Leibhaftigen Selbstheit, the self in the flesh. So the radical community of essential intuition and perception is attested to on page 10, where he says, and this is in the second paragraph in the middle of that, no intuition of essence is possible without the free possibility of turning one's regard to a corresponding individual and forming a consciousness of an example, just as conversely, no intuition of something individual is possible without the free possibility of bringing about an essence or an ideation. So closely are the individual and the essence given as moments of the same sort of narrative of consciousness that you could not have one without the other. So what are we to make of the following claim in italics that the two sorts of intuition are essentially different? If you can move from one to the other, if they are both immediately able to be grasped as intuition, then what are we to do with justifying it? I think justifying the difference of essential intuition is not what he's trying to do. He is saying it simply happens. The difference between essential intuition and perception happens. It happens to us, and it happens as us. And so the modes of intuition mark themselves out, and it's our job to test it in our experience and to say, do I have this experience of essences? And if I do they mark themselves out as different from straightforward perceiving of objects? And if so, how? I'm going to move to section 6 now. And I realize that we're skipping over things, or that I am. And after we break, you can always go back to other pieces of this and add to it. In section 6, Husserl both separates the experience of universality and necessity in reference to the essences we intuit, and links them together as correlates. This is important because phenomenology will have to be an eidetic description rooted in the very manners of givenness of objects. Phenomenology will need to have both a universal and a necessary way of talking about the events of consciousness. So we can't just speak universally. We can't just speak necessarily about our particular experiences. We have to speak in both. But he does not immediately connect universal propositions with necessary ones. As he indicates here, it's not always the case that universality and necessity are internally linked in terms of other sciences. If you look at the top of page 15, we see how he's talking about, quote, the application of geometrical truths to cases in nature. So I just want to hopefully say something interesting or important about the relation between eidetic regional ontology and phenomenological description as necessary, insofar as we're trying to get phenomenology to see the essence of consciousness and to describe it in necessarily correlative ways. So, in geometry, we have a necessary way of understanding that if we have a three-sided figure, a whole lot of things follow from that. From the assumption of space, all kinds of axioms follow. And we can also apply geometry to what he'll call later the life world. But this is really problematic because we don't know how or why geometry works in the world in which we live. There is no triangle in our world. There is no straight line, right? But architects can build buildings based on the principles of geometry that stand up. They hold themselves together. There's only approximation of the truths of geometry, yet they work in the world, and we don't know why. So the truths of geometry as universal are necessary only within a certain set of assumptions, but don't carry over into lived experience. Geometry is thus grounded purely in the essence of a material thing. And he says that in the middle of page 15, with all material things are extended. And in the essence of extension, but it does not prescribe the necessity of our experience in the life world and within the natural attitude as non-arithmetical. Free fantasy as a method of achieving an essence does work to allow the essence to show through on its own. But whether and how this connects to the intuition of perception is not itself given just by that fact. All right, I'm going to keep moving to section 9. Hi, Olga. Nice to see you. So this is where Randy was talking about regional ontology, regional eidetics. Experiential sciences have a foundation in eidetic ontologies. What I notice in this section 9 is that a regional eidos, which is the essence of all objects as such in that region, at the very bottom of the page, page 18, exhibits a necessary material form of all the objects in that region. And I just want to pause a little bit and notice how amazing that is. We don't just see individuals, we see essences, and a regional essence is a direct seeing of the form of all of the objects that that region takes on. There's a movie that I like to use in teaching. It's called The Sixth Sense, and you may remember it. It has Mel Gibson in it. And there's a little kid in there, and the kid is sort of whispering and is terrified because of his power. And his power is that he sees dead people. And so he says, I see dead people. We see not just essences, we see regional essences. We see the form of all possible objects within a science. And we do so immediately. You know, if you're trying to justify how he can say that, try the opposite. Try to account for the way a science hangs together if we do not have the immediate power to experience directly the form or the essence of all objects in that region. You know, there's another problem, of course, with sciences that are not pure or like math. If you think about biology, biology rests on a concept or an intuition of life. And yet, biology has a really hard time, as far as I can tell, clarifying that initial concept. Biology can try to name some moments that make up life, like nutrition, growth, movement, discrimination, interaction with the environment. It can name some processes, but it cannot purely avoid the same problems as geometry. Based on what biology can do, we can develop, for example, and this goes to Bill's question, I think, antidepressants. But we have no idea how antidepressants or why antidepressants can cause a change in consciousness. We can predict that they will, based on intuitive and inductive evidence. We can even be certain enough to regulate our lives with them. But we cannot account for how that science can affect changes in consciousness. How does a drug event that produces neurosynaptic movement or change affect meaning? We just simply don't know. And so I think what Husserl is trying to do here is, on the one hand, show how remarkable it is that all sciences, even the ones that we can't quite clarify, how remarkable it is that even biology and geometry rest on intuitions of regional essences, and yet also show the way that universality and necessity are uncoupled, to show that phenomenology will be unique among all these sciences, both the exact and the more experiential. It will be unique insofar as phenomenology will hold itself to the standard of connecting necessary description with universal insight. I think that's where he's moving. So then I'll go to section 17, and I'll stop and invite us to take our first 10, 15 minutes of discussion. So I asked us to read section 17, at least for me. You know, I kind of check out. I have to really fight myself when reading these more abstruse or logical discussions that Husserl does. Because as I told you, I read Husserl as a Merleau-Ponty person, and I love Merleau-Ponty because he's so concrete. But I think 17 tries to get at why he begins with world and with essence in this whole book on ideas. So I think the point of this first chapter comes here. In the first paragraph, he says, it has been our purpose to outline, on the basis of pure logic, a schema in conformity with which individua must be determinable under concepts and laws, or in the way in which all empirical sciences must be grounded on regional ontologies relevant to them, and not merely on pure logic. So he's using logic to say everything rests on experience. And if you want to be able to connect universality and necessity, you have to have a schema, a plan, an organizational structure that links those two things. He wants to say, in short, that sciences that are empirical rest on or are grounded on regional ontologies that presuppose the intuition of essences. They are not given as sciences simply from or by pure logic. You have to see life, even in a confused way, to begin to develop biology. You have to see space, even in a confused way, to begin to develop geometry. Science as a task is something that he goes on to talk about in the next paragraph, the idea of a task. Within the circle of our intuitions of individuals, to effect a distribution of all intuited individual being according to regions of being, each of which marks off an eidetic and empirical science. What we need is to move from perception as an immediate grasp of an object as sort of gearing us into a world in which things are interconnected by certain rules, by certain forms. We need to distribute those according to regional essences by way of the kind of mysterious eruption of essences and of regional forms that happen in the midst of our experience. So this means that phenomenology is pursuing, at least this is how I interpret it, phenomenology is pursuing one essence, its regional eidos. And what is that? The eidos of consciousness or experience or Leibniz as such. This separation of phenomenology, if you buy that consciousness or experience is not a separate subjective description, but rather an engagement, an intertwining, this separation of phenomenology from all these other sciences which focus solely outward on the object will allow Husserl to move from individual consciousness to the essence of consciousness as such, to know how we are compelled to answer to experience as such, which is the fundamental essence that we're pursuing, and to joining intuition and description. Okay, so that's what I had to, that's what I've worked on for those sections. What I'd like to do is now ask us for 10 or 15 minutes to talk about anything that you would like to talk about with respect to sections 1 through 17. And remember, I am recording. If you would like me to stop recording when you ask your questions, I can certainly do that. And you don't have to worry about offending me if you disagree with me or you think I'm not clear. You can also say that. I'm not particularly offended. But please feel free to say anything that's on your mind, and then we'll return to the text for sections 23 and 24 in about 15 minutes.
Well, I'll jump right in if nobody else wants to. I'm particularly interested in footnote 13 on page 19, section 3. And that's where Husserl gives a somewhat emotional reaction to criticisms of this thesis that he received from Oswald Kulpe. Kulpe was one of the original psychophysicists at the Würzburg School, and he criticized Husserl for being a cognitivist. That is, for being rather intellectualizing what, instead of this semi-mysterious lived experience. And Husserl denies that and says, you've completely misunderstood everything I've said and you're stupid. Kulpe and his people there were very early precursors to the Gestalt psychology movement. That is, they felt that ideas were presented as a Gestalt, as a whole, and not they weren't atomists. And so my question is coming around from there to the very last section, the conclusion in paragraph 17, where Husserl seems to assert a more Gestalt view and say, well, look, these are just different regions of being, and you don't want to get all atomistic about what makes them up. We simply judge. Some objects are empirical and some are ideas. And so I'm not sure what his dispute is with Kulpe. Husserl is kind of cognitive, he is kind of intellectual, but he does grasp this Gestalt idea. So I'm not real clear on what this dispute's about. Well, that's enough said. Maybe that's not very clear, but that's the general region of my question.
I think my question is similar to Bill's. I also was struck by the reference to Kulpe, and I'm wondering if Peter's emphasis on his alliance with Merleau-Ponty helped, because, as I recall, I wanted to ask Peter whether what he has in mind is Merleau-Ponty's phrase entre deux, between the two, which Varela, Thompson, and Roche pick up and run with in their 1991 book, The Embodied Mind, which really was the beginning, I think, of bringing over into neuroscience this kind of entre deux, allowing mentality, allowing consciousness in the door in a way that could be more productive than earlier purely positivistic or behavioristic analyses allowed it to be. And it seemed to me that these paragraphs by Husserl go in that direction, and allowed me to understand what it was he might be reacting to in Kulpe, although I couldn't find a copy of the book by Kulpe that he mentions in there. He in the note it's given in English, but I couldn't find it.
I can certainly try to say something in response to both of your questions and comments, although I have to be honest, I struggle, because so many of you are so well versed in in this book and in phenomenology. I struggle with being the point person and then wanting to have it be democratic. So that'll be a continuing struggle for me. I guess I can say this. I like the entre deux, like I like the fact that consciousness may very well be the being between a notion of subjectivity and a notion of objectivity that are both ours and not ours at the same time. And that might cash itself out as being almost caught between intuition and essential intuition, and ourselves being the site of the interplay of those things. And so I think given this really requires us to reconceive what we understand the relationship of consciousness and objectivity to be. We are neither fully responsible nor fully passive. And that doesn't fit any of the categories previously discussed by any of the figures that he's mentioning. I think for myself, when Merleau-Ponty and the visible and the invisible talks about flesh, I think that's what he's talking about. I think the world as perceiving itself through us, which is what I take flesh to be for Merleau-Ponty, is something like what Husserl is talking about with respect to essential intuition. I am not fully in charge. I'm not fully devoid of responsibility, but I am part of this upsurge, which I have to get a handle on, and which necessarily begins, going back to Bruno's point and other people's point, necessarily begins in the middle of things and cannot affect a systematic discussion until I reckon with where I am in the middle of things. So anyway, that's how I would initially respond. But I'm sure other people have interesting ways to go about it too.
I just like to say that I think the point you're making about consciousness being simultaneously and inherently both our doing and something that is doing through us, I think that is, I agree that that's totally fundamental in Husserl. And a lot of the disagreements or different kinds of interpretations that people come up with in trying to understand what Husserl is all about, I think really can be seen as attempts to grapple with exactly this point about it's both our agency and not our agency all in one. And so, and then you're presenting one way of looking at that, which I guess, and obviously that's a big issue. I guess what I really want to say is whether or not one agrees with your way of looking at it, nevertheless, this is certainly, in my view, maybe the core issue in phenomenology. And it also relates to, is he a realist or idealist? Maybe a slightly different way of looking at it is that Husserl kind of left questions like this open, and it falls to people like Merleau-Ponty to try to take it a step further and give an account of what's really going on here.
Well, one thing that I'm following up on what Jeremy just said, that Husserl is not giving us here so much, but would be nice for each of us to think about is if consciousness is this kind of weird thing, this new thingy, these intentional objects, whatever you want to call them, is to, even if we can't understand how it's done, it would be nice to have a why we would believe this. And the way it would seem to me to come about is that you consider, as I think he does in LI, between some sort of naive realism and idealism, and find that neither of them is satisfactory. They don't account for our experience. And so it would be nice to, if we do it ourselves or here, to try to list these things which are contrary to either of those paradigms. And so then leaves it unspoken as to why, but that but it is that it is.
I again, I hope that you all will just start talking to each other and not just me. But I love the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and there's a point in the movie where I think it's Paul Newman's character is told to stand here and shoot bottles off a fence to apply for a job, and he can't hit a single one. And then he asks the guy, "Can I move?" "Can you what?" "Can I move?" And he can move. As he can move, and he can hit every single one. And I feel like something like that is occurring with Husserl in this book, with respect to realism and idealism, and with respect to the new way of understanding consciousness. And I think he isn't just doing this, but I think it's sort of like, look what I can do. Look what we can do. Once you adopt this, if you can check each time, right? Do I have essential intuition? Is it different from perception? Are they convertible with one another? Which is what he said in these sections. Then what do I get to say about things that I formerly took to be completely settled? Do I actually get to extend givenness by means of my descriptions? What do I achieve, for example, in talking about biblical texts that people thought were closed by means of taking seriously consciousness as an eruption into existence? So I think part of it might be becoming more systematic, as you said, Bill, and allowing us to list the structures of consciousness which don't fall into either realism or idealism. But part of it is also just doing the method and finding how productive it is, and then saying, wow, I didn't see that before, and I didn't see it before because I didn't take this seriously. Which is not to imply you don't take it seriously. It's just, I think it's sort of like you learn by doing.
Peter, in response to what you just said, I mean, I totally agree with you. My approach to phenomenology is something that necessarily begins in the middle of things, as you said, and you learn by doing. You do it, and by doing it, you see that you're able to accomplish more and more, ever widening circles of the just comprehension, understanding. But he doesn't begin ideas one by saying that. He begins ideas one by saying, here is this fantastical categorization of everything that is. And I am using pure logic, he says in paragraph 17, our whole consideration has been a purely logical one. It has not moved in any material sphere or in any determinate region. It has spoken universally of regions and categories. So is he putting the cart before the horse here and saying, here is a formalization of the eidetic seeing that I'm going to be describing in a little bit, that is accomplished by that very eidetic seeing? And if so, why begin with the formal ontology? Why begin with the like, here is the schema that we are going to fill out?
I would just like to say I really appreciate that question. That is essential. I've always been very skeptical of any philosophy that begins with an ontology prior to an epistemology, because whenever anybody, I mean, this is, commonplace, they lay down their ontology, and my first question is, how do you know that? You need to start with an epistemology in order to generate the ontology, otherwise it has no grounding. That comment was a key comment. I like that. And I don't know the answer why Husserl does that, because it seems to be a mistake.
Well, I know that we're not supposed to talk about other things, but this reminds me of the way that Aristotle is studied. You begin with the organon. You begin with, here are the categories. Here is how logic works. But the key thing to realize about that is that somebody ordered those treatises that way. And that is not necessarily the way that Aristotle would have said that one should proceed. But here Husserl is saying, let me do a similar kind of thing. And in my presentation of what pure phenomenology is, this is what I start with. I start with the idea of sciences, with the idea of regional ontologies, with a pure logic that has been determined ahead of time. And yeah, I don't know what to make of it.
You know, it's funny you bring that up. In fact, I keep going over here because I'm trying to figure out which piece of the organon is it. The topics. I think it's topics 1.1 or anywhere. It doesn't really matter. But somewhere Aristotle begins by saying, you know, we know some things, but we're gonna like get a more solid footing as we go. You know, we're gonna start like defining terms and stuff, but we know some things. You know, so we do begin in the midst of the world and of the world of thought and science. But he wants to but Husserl wants to, like, you know, create this new science. And I going on what you were saying before the Aristotle stuff as well, you know, that there is a kind of asymmetry to the order of knowing or of knowledge and of being, right? And this is present as well in like Plato and Aristotle, but in general, you know, with the kind of Cartesian you know, revolution that Husserl is clearly, you know, on the side of, or, you know, building upon, right? Critiquing as well. You know, that there's this apodictic moment, this apodicticity that he's already making thematic here, that we want to stand upon, and that's the great gain, you know. And then as he goes to distinguish, which is a cognitive noetic act, distinguish the formal from the regional material, you know, different types of analysis, and then, you know, maybe do an analogous thing with ontology as we proceed. And that's probably also, I was thinking, why we don't get the noema discussion until after all this noesis discussion.
Yeah, Randy, but isn't the point of the reduction precisely to eliminate the distinction between the order of knowing and the order of being?
Tell me more.
Well, yeah, in the natural attitude, sure, you can talk about things that are more knowable for us versus things that are more knowable in themselves, whatever that means. But once you enact the reduction, then the being of things, I think, becomes the manner in which it is given, in which they are given, and the manner in which their sense is accomplished. That's what we're looking at in phenomenology. And so we're not talking, so I guess maybe I should just ask, what do you mean by the order of being, and how do you see that at play during phenomenology?
Well, I mean, it certainly brings us away from the text, right? But the ordo cognoscendi versus the ordo, I don't know, there's some tradition out there in the study of Platonism, particularly the Tübingen Platonism, the agrapha dogmata stuff. They like to highlight this distinction, but it's also just a general. But I guess, I mean, you could just say like epistemology versus ontology. And my point generally, and tied to the text, my point is that maybe we do have to do the noetic carving of the or the noetic dissemination of the apodictic moment of the Cartesian cogito in the manner of the reduction as founding a noetic apodicticity in general, and then upon that we can stand when we then continue on to the material and universal ontology. But first we need to, for Husserl at least in this moment of Ideas 1, first we need to establish this cognitive side of things, and in the realm of epistemology, decide how to approach cognitive essentialities and distinguish them from universalities and idealities in general. And then once we've carved up the ground a bit, so that we're standing on only the solid ground of thought, then to use this new science, this new institution to continue on into things about the noemata content, and therefore also filling the phenomena, filling these empty forms. I mean, so I was just perceiving a sort of asymmetry in these two sides, which I thought you were also saying. So I was just kind of trying to, bump back on that. Echo your point.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's an asymmetry. And what leaves me perplexed is that Husserl says that these regional ontologies are determined according to concepts and laws that are the result of a certain kind of eidetic seeing. And so then there is a conjunction, at least at a certain point, of the seeing, the experiencing, the knowing, and the formal ontology that results from it. But the ontology should come after. The ontology is a result of the eidetic seeing.
Olga.
Right?
Olga, you're muted. We can't hear you. Still, well, we can't hear you still. Okay. So I like the discussion that we're having. I think I'd like to move on to 23 and 24. I will say, though, a couple of things. Chapter 1 begins with him talking about how cognition begins with experience and remains within experience, and then world. And I personally think it's a mistake to think that we're only focusing on the noetic in this first part. I think he's going out of his way to talk about essences as the kinds of noema that are intertwined with the act of seeing. So I'm not sure that he does begin with ontology, but he does begin with a kind of logical consideration that he then says is not the foundation for science in that section 17. But anyway, we could continue with that later. Olga put something in the chat. Okay, that's all right. All right, let's look at 23 and 24, and then we'll have another chance to continue the excellent discussions that we're having. And again, you're not compelled to talk or ask questions, but you're certainly invited to. So if we look now in chapter 2, at section 23, and this is a chapter in which he does sort of say it's not quite empiricism, it's not quite idealism. If you look at section 23, he continues to talk about essential intuition by asking whether it is really our doing. And the theme that comes up in 23 is spontaneity. There is a certain amount of spontaneity, and there is a certain amount of initiative and involvement. However, whatever we are responsible for, that thing is the consciousness of the essence and not the essence itself. So in sort of below the middle of page 43, he says, as a consequence, in spontaneous abstracting, it is also not the essence which is generated, but instead the consciousness of the essence. Now, I think that the reason he emphasizes this is, again, because essence, as the correlate of the act, is a driving force, at least equal to whatever our consciousness of it is, and which is thoroughly intertwined with it. Our role is to do what we need to do to allow the essence to appear. But the essence is self-giving. And so he goes on, an originary presentive, which is gebende, consciousness of an essence, is in itself and necessarily spontaneous. It's an awaiting for the appearance of the essence. Like, we do what we can do. We modify in fantasy the color of this table and the size and the number of legs or whatever it is, and we get the essence table. But getting the essence is not simply because we have done these modifications. The ability to intuit the essence is not the product of abstraction. Our capacity to get it is the process of abstraction, but it itself is not. So he says on the next page, on 44, at the end of section 23, he says that this is a complex act, this intuiting of essences. And I think he means complex to indicate in an implicit way noetic and noematic. And it's more like perception, because even if it involves fantasy and will, there is the arrival, the immediacy, the givenness, the advent, if you will, of the essence that we prepare for but do not control. And this goes even to talking about geometry or math. We experience essences as always already there. When people began to understand Euclid, they began to experience the spatial structures as always already having pre-existed their awareness of them. Let's move into section 24, which is a very short section, but I think is quite important. And I think it is underread for the way in which phenomenology operates in terms of the structure of its own descriptions. So he says, the principle of all principles names the intertwining of experience, the happening and the initiative interrelated between subject and object. It says the thing is offered to us, darbietet, and we, what do? Accept it as what it gives itself to be. It says presented as being, als was es sich gibt, as what it gives itself to be. We accept the terms and the limits. I'm still looking at the italicized piece in the first paragraph. We accept the terms and the limits by which it appears. Offering, accepting, it's like a conversation, an intimacy. What I find most interesting here is the fact that this conversation between the thing that it's appearing and my consciousness of it leads us immediately to try to say what is going on. And in his mind, right, he talks about a statement, and how our statements can, quote, confer expression, still in the same first paragraph, by simple explication, and that this is the absolute beginning. So it seems like what he is suggesting is that we do not yet have the terms or the syntactical tools ready beforehand to describe experience. The principle of all principles means, to me anyway, that simple explication is difficult and never finished. It's why the epoche becomes important. We need continuously to ask ourselves how good a job we're doing of expressing what the phenomenon gives itself to be. And that's why the epoche will be multiple. There'll be multiple steps. If you look at the end of the next paragraph, and he's talking as if to a scientific investigator of nature who isn't quite yet a phenomenologist. But he comes up with this idea, I think, that the principle of all principles, with the principle of the grounding of all cognition of matters of fact by experience, is not itself given with insight in experience. So the questions that you all were raising at the very beginning, he acknowledges. Is this principle of all principles offering the thing offering itself and we accepting it within the limits of how it is presented itself? Like, is this principle of all principles given with insight within experience? It seems not. Hence, why Husserl will have to talk about the epoche as this radical and new practice by which we allow experience itself to show itself in its ontological structure. And I think it's so hard, if the reading that I'm proposing is correct, I think it's extraordinarily difficult to get away from the idea that he is still separating cognition from object. Noesis and noema have the same basic Greek root, and I think there's a reason for that. It's one thing. And he has to go back and forth to zigzag, and he realizes that he has to go back and forth, and he's going to say that later in Ideas 1. But it's one thing. And so experience will have to call for this principle of all principles, but not ground it or make it intuitive. Like, we have to do that. Experience isn't going to call this principle out for us because we have already committed to the separation of subject and object, to the separation of us and world. We have proclaimed ontologically that being is the separation of self and world. And the only way that we can come to the principle of all principles is to recognize that that might not be true. And the only way to do that is it was almost like, where the hell did Socrates come from? Like, who knows? He's practically a gift from God. To overcome the natural attitude is to have some sort of experience that pushes the experiencer into the principle of all principles by mechanisms that we're not clear about until we actually see the unity of the subject and object. So that's what I see him doing in 23 and 24, is taking this radical stance to say, you want to know where this method is? It's not in experience, but experience is calling for it. Let's take a quick break and allow you to talk about that, because I know there were a lot of people, in addition to 17, who had 24 as something they'd like to talk about.
Yeah, just I mean, I think that's really very helpful, the way you set that up. I mean, what strikes me is this use of this word legitimizing, in the German is Rechtsquelle, Quelle. So like literally the source of right, and so it's like that within experience, we are subject to something that legitimizes or doesn't our claim to cognition. And we could call that truth or falsity, or however we want to call it, but it is a kind of there's a normative claim going on here that this principle functions normatively. in relation to our experience. And I think that's a kind of a key move that he makes here.
And I think partly what you're implying, and I think I agree with this, that what Husserl is up to is something that challenges, for example, the very idea that you have to start with epistemology to get to ontology. And the first chapter is not trying to set up some sort of logic that he takes on its own and that we see in terms of that objective logic. It may look like that at first, but I really don't think that's what is going on there. It's getting more to exactly the point that we're focusing on now.
I agree with what you said, Jeremy. I think this last elaboration by Peter answers my question. That is, this reading of the principle of principles justifies the so-called starting with ontology because of the key term acceptance. The thing is presented, it's true, and that looks like a declaration of ontology, but the acceptance of that is an active noetic process, and so it's not really pure mind-independent ontology. It never was. So this is a new way to, it changes my criticism, which is wonderful. Thank you.
I don't want to cut anyone off, but I realize that it's 1:35, and so I'm going to push on a little bit to do as many as we can, and that way try to keep the whole book in our sights, as it were. If I've cut you off, I apologize. But let's continue this in section 27. So this is the world of the natural attitude. So he's going to move into discussing the natural attitude as the path of grounding the principle of all principles. I think that's why he talks about the natural attitude. Again, like in chapter 1, we start with world, but here in terms of our consciousness of it. So he says in the second little paragraph, I am conscious of the world. And again, you could ask yourself, why does he keep coming back to world over and over and over again? Right? And I have an answer to that myself, but I mean, you might want to think about it. And in this section, he's also going to be talking about the role of attention, how we turn our regard, and of, on page 52, the halo, the ring of the world that remains as background from what we are focusing on. So if you look in the first full paragraph, the co-present, which makes up a constant halo around the field of actual perception. So our attention is a process that is an acting or a movement, because the world as halo is, and this is in the middle of that paragraph, reaching, it says reaches into the unlimited. So somehow the experience of world, even in the natural attitude, is bringing us continuously along with it. The world is thus the possibility and support for my continuous expanding life of consciousness. It is my home. That's what I think he means here. And as a home, it enables and entitles me to gain habits of self-transcendence. I continually notice new meaning because the world, even if only, as he says at the end of that paragraph, as the form of world, is pre-delineated in each perception. So if Kant says the I think accompanies all presentations, here it's like the world accompanies all. The world is the gearing into that I'm already doing. So the regional eidos, the form of the world, this is where I think phenomenology is grounded. Regional eidos, form of the world, is part of the essential description of the happening of experience. Experience as such thus announces itself as the intertwining even in the natural attitude. Quote, I find myself in relation to the world. This is on page 53, where he says about waking consciousness. It is continually on hand for me, and I myself am a member of it. Now he deals with this paradox all the way through his work, and it starts here, right? This is the great paradox that doesn't become completely explicit. I am in the world and yet conscious of the world. Here's where he says it, right? I find myself in relation. I myself am a member. This is the ontological structure of experience as a paradox that we cannot clarify. We simply notice it and we move through it and with it. If we look at section 28, we're still in the natural attitude. We have still not yet discovered what that attitude, and the word for attitude is Einstellung, is. We only know that the world embraces the object and sustains multiple layers of meaning and appearance of each object. We know the function of the form of the world. It embraces each object. We learned that in section 1. And it makes possible all of the multiple ways in which we can perceive the object. So what is useful in understanding the natural attitude, though, is not just the world, but also the cogito. He talks about Descartes using the expression cogito, embracing on page 54, about 8 lines down, all of the kinds of acts that I do. This expression, taken over from Descartes, is a kind of parallel to world. Our modes of action are embraced by the cogito, much as the modes of objects and their interlocking system of references are embraced by the world. Another way to think about that is the cogito is the world of our acts. Thus, 27 and 28 are the path toward recognizing that their intertwining happens on an eidetic, regional, and ontological level. I can be a part of the world and be conscious of the world because something in my structure calls out to the structure of world. There is some notion of embrace and cogito, which is rooted in the embrace of world to all that makes it up. And somehow those two kinds of unities, those logical orderings, are going to mesh. So there's a radical community, if you remember from the earlier section about radical community between the intuition of essences and the essence itself, or between, as I said, the intuition of essences and straightforward perceiving. There's a radical community present between cogito and world just as much as there was those two. So I always find myself as a member of the world. I always find myself as someone who is perceiving. I'll go a few more, if you will permit me. Let's look at number 30, the general positing. So having discussed world and cogito, Husserl now talks about the fundamental action that we do within the natural attitude, the general positing. And I find the German really interesting here. It's General Thesis, right? The general thesis, the basic thesis that I have. It's not just positing, right? It's taking a stand. It's a thesis. So I see, what is this thesis? The thesis is, on page 57, 2 lines down at the very end of that line, I find the actuality as a factually existing actuality and also accept it as it gives itself, says presents, but it gives itself to me. And what does that mean concretely? The world is always there. So I see or find actuality as such, as a whole, W-H-O-L-E, in the natural attitude. I find the actuality, the world. So what does this mean? What is the general positing? It is being lost in the world by an action that I do that sees the world as really, obviously, evidently separate from me, as claiming existence on its own. That's the basic way I understand the general positing, that being as such has as one of its modes the existence of the world as independent from me. And I take that as obvious, and instead of focusing on consciousness as a whole, or even on my own acts, I focus on the things outside. I get lost in the world. That will lead us to 31. I'll do a couple more. Maybe I'll just do this one more and then stop, because this is a long section. And then, yeah, maybe 31 and 32 and then stop. We'll see. But then I do want to hear what you have to say. So in 31, Husserl continues to talk about the General Thesis of the natural attitude. He emphasizes three things on page 57. It's not a particular act. These are quotes, right? It lasts continuously, and it's not necessarily an explicit judgment. So it's not a particular act. It's some total act that I do to recognize the total actuality of the world. It lasts continuously. I don't have to keep reflecting on it. It's part of everything that I do in the natural attitude. And it's not necessarily an explicit judgment. I don't have to be aware of what I'm doing. It is also on the top of page 58, somehow inherent before I am able to recognize it. If we think about why we call emotional attitudes attitudes, we could gain some understanding, right? If I have a student who's giving me an attitude, don't give me attitude, right? What does that mean? It's not just a particular emotion. It's an entire way. It's a whole way of perceiving the world, the classroom, the text, me. It's like some all-embracing structure psychologically. Well, we're not psychologically thinking here, but if you think about what the natural attitude means, it means a kind of whole engagement without explicit awareness. The young person who gives me attitude isn't usually aware of what the attitude is, what motivates it, how long it's been happening, all those sorts of things. So just like wrestling with our own emotional attitudes, we can't get rid of this one in the natural attitude by fighting it head on. In fact, if you confront someone about their attitude head on, guaranteed it's not going to be easy, right? And probably they're not going to change. So who fought the natural attitude head on, or thought that he did? Descartes thought that by doing universal doubt, he could somehow undo the universal attitude of ontology that he found we were caught in. Rather, Husserl reflects, not using Descartes' doubt, at the bottom of, it's sort of the middle of 58, in italics. Let us reflect on what lies in the essence of such an act. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because in the sort of towards the bottom is, well, the essence of Descartes' universal doubt was a certain annulment of positing. That's in italics. The word annulment is Aufhebung, which, if anyone knows Hegel, it's like, oh crap, here we are. It is the annulment, which is kind of an erasure, but a preservation, and who knows what, you know. So does he mean Hegel? I think he does. I really think he means to be very demonstrative with the word annulment because of what he goes on to say. He says, our epoche will be an Aufhebung, a surpassing that is also a kind of preservation. It is not, he says, a transmutation, an Umwandlung. Remember how I talked about, you know, transmutation, the intuition of the individual could be transmuted into the essence? Well, this is not like that. What we're doing is not changing something into some new kind of thing. So that radical transmutation that happened from the experience of an individual to the experience of the essence is not what we're doing here, because that transmutation was not our doing. It depended on the givenness of the object to show itself. Here, there is something that we're doing, and it's not quite the same thing. We are not turning intuition into essence. We are not turning straightforward conviction into doubt. It is something, as he says at the bottom of 58, wholly peculiar. So what is it that he's talking about? This is the whole method of phenomenology, right? You all know this. But before he gets to what, or as he's getting to what it is, putting something out of action, excluding it, parenthesizing it, he says something that I had never read before until preparing to talk with all of you, which is about 8 lines down from the top of 59. He says, we can also say the positing, the General Thesis, is a mental process. It's an Erlebnis. There's a natural lived experience of the actuality of the world. That's why it is so total and so complete. We experience the world as given, as separate, or at least it appears that way within this attitude that we take. We experience the world as obviously actual, as existing on its own. And so what does that mean? That when we suspend it now or put out of action the claim that it makes to separable being, we are doing something unique and new. We are holding ourselves accountable to the evidence that experience presents on its own within the limits of how it presents itself, which would mean, and we could check on this ourselves, would mean that the world does not appear as separate and as existing on its own with absolute evidence. It appears as intertwined with us. So I think that's what the refraining from judgment and the making no use of means. This is putting out of action our prejudice about being in order to show the correlation between subject and object, between act and object, between intuiting and intuited, between world and cogito. What are we doing? Putting the brakes on a whole attitude of ours that takes as obvious the world as appearing as being on its own, independently of us. We're not getting rid of it. We're not doubting it. All we're doing is saying, does the world appear on its own? And how does it appear on its own? And what evidence did I have for that? So on page 60, he shows how in parenthesizing at the bottom of, well, the end paragraph of 31, he says parenthesizing is a metaphor, Bild in German. And putting out of action is a locution or Rede, which means, right, that we're not really parenthesizing and we're not really putting out of action. We're not exactly doing what we say. But what we are doing is emphasizing in various terms that there is an act component and an object component to both the natural attitude and the epoche. He basically says that parenthesizing is the noetic act that gears into the noesis, and putting out of action is the noematically geared act, and both of them are necessary because we have to account for both parts, noema and noesis, of the overall general thesis that encompasses the natural attitude. I'll talk a little bit about 32 and then stop for listening to you. So the phenomenological epoche then is the attempt to use the method of parenthesizing to discover, as he says at the bottom of 60, a new scientific domain. I think what he means is both the domain of studying experience as the intertwining of subject and object, and the domain of how to describe that. A self-regulated science that can ground its description in the appearance of the objects within that regional ontology is the goal. So what we discover is that at the top of the page 61, that the essence of the natural attitude is the taking of being as obvious and as separate from consciousness. This taking up of the supposed obviousness of separation of world or thing from cogito is what we address. And the parenthesis simply, this is in italics in the middle of 61, shuts me off completely from any judgment about spatiotemporal factual Dasein. It says being, but it's Dasein, existence. So the epoche introduces a gap or a barrier between me and my attempt to judge about Dasein, about existence. But that gap reveals the intimacy, the gap between me and my judgment. I cut myself off from my judgment, but not from being and the meaning of being. In fact, I allow myself to notice the very particular and tending or entwining of being and meaning when I notice the intimate correlation that I have with the world. As Husserl says here, the world as a whole is now without, and this is on page 62, sorry, this is the last paragraph towards the bottom of it. The world as a whole, the whole prediscovered world, is now without validity for us. And in German, gilt uns jetzt nichts. Doesn't quite mean without validity for us. You know, it does mean that it's proper for us no longer to play the game as of determining the world as separable. What's not valid for us is our own treatment of the obviousness of a separable world. This is why I think from the very beginning, he is both not doing an ontology and deriving phenomenology from logic, but he is also doing an ontology, namely what it is that we are as the intertwining or the unfolding of subject and object. And I think that's where he basically says that. So I'll stop now, and maybe we could take about 10 minutes for you to talk about any of those sections 27 through 32.
I would just like to say that the first thing I wrote down, going back to number one, was, these were my notes. He's basically talking about embodiment. And the way I see it is that he's saying that, like, our consciousness is encased in our body, and that's a relationship, but also we are steeped, immersed in this context, this thing we call the world. And that's a relationship too. But when you were, the last point, what you were saying, Peter, it struck me that he's saying, and I'm not arguing with this, but I'm saying he's basically asking you to suspend the way you are in the world naturally in order to understand meaning. And because then for me, it becomes a circular conundrum, because I mean, in the natural attitude, that is how we understand the world. And so that's.
If I may, I kind of am getting a fascinating little picture from all the stuff we've been doing in the form of a kind of metaphor. Because we keep talking about the world, and in the beginning of this chapter, you know, the image is of horizons, the halo, the background, Hintergrund, all these like words for the surrounding, right? And the activity that we're engaging in, as we can see now with this epoche, is a sort of disengagement from you know, making judgment about it, and thereby being able to stand in relief on it, and then you know, to see where we were in it and how we are in it. So there's like a kind of image that I see developing of, first we're immersed in the world, we're immersed in the world and the scientific attitude, the natural attitude of science as well, you know, but there's something about science that that summons the nous, right? It summons the noetic activity, and this summoning is a sort of bringing us up above the water in a kind of vertical dimension, and in that verticality, a sort of principle of all principles brings us to this radical, you know, this parenthesizing act, standing in relief from it all. Then we look down and we can see the warp and the weft, you know, of the woof, and, you know, the transverse and the longitudinal enmeshment which we were once in, that was whirled around us, you know, spun on perhaps the spindle of necessity. You know, the world is that that whirling, you know, around what? Around that which rose in this vertical way. And then, you know, you can see the Long's intentionality, the longitudinal warp or woof, you know, and the weft or the woof. Yeah. So I mean, just these images of weaving and like the way we are embedded, entwined, you know, to use the Merleau-Pontian kind of imagery that becomes more thematic with Merleau-Ponty, you know, I get this image of like kind of maybe it's like a kind of like ocean in which we are immersed, and then we rise above because of the power of knowing and of science, you know, and we see, you know, and that's like the being able to see in this new way, these Idee, these validities, Geltungs, and we see the whole sphere, this Geltungssphäre, within which we were and are, but we can, you know, our eyes are opened.
Peter, I want to try to repeat. There are at least two things you said that I've never thought before. One of them, I'm not sure I can even think because I'm still thinking about what it was. But the second one has to do with this idea that hadn't occurred to me. And so I want to repeat it to make sure that this is what you think Husserl is saying. And that it seems to be he's saying, what I hear you saying, is that he's saying that, that the essences are self-given and they're given as a kind of Heil almost. And that, so that's the first thing. I don't think I ever considered that before. And then the other thing associated with that sort of is this notion about the natural attitude. And this picks up on something that Schutz mentions, because the Schutz considers the natural attitude to be an epoche itself. And you seem to be saying that Husserl is saying something very similar. And so that we follow Schutz, this kind of notion that what we're really doing in any of these reductions or epoches is that we're just doing different kinds of epoches. But the one that I'm still trying to, I have to think about this, the idea that, if I understand this correctly, that the eidos, the essence, is somehow given prior to my participation, my constitution. That seems extraordinarily weird to me. Like if I see a tree outside my window, it doesn't seem to me that what's given, self-given, is a tree. Something may be given, but it's not a tree. Anyway, so I'm still struggling with that notion. If that is what you claim that Husserl is saying. Maybe I don't understand what he means by essence. Anyway.
So Bill, I can say a few things, but lots of people will probably have other things to say too, to your question. For Husserl, consciousness is always consciousness of, so that's one of the essential insights in Ideas 1, but it's always consciousness as well, right? So the object always appears as something. And that's because we stay within the limits of how the object gives itself to us. So the only way in which a tree does not give itself as a tree is if I am an infant and cannot yet see things in the world in front of me. As soon as I begin to see things and move through the world, the references between individuals, whether I intend them to vary for one another or not, the references between the individuals pressure a certain kind of insight for Husserl, namely the givenness of the essence, whether I can articulate the word tree or not. So the only way in which essences would not be given is if we presuppose a kind of narrative of consciousness that is in fact an overlaying of previously given cognition onto a world. What he's saying is that this, the way I take it, is that the upsurge of consciousness as within the world, like Sally was saying, is the very web that Randy was saying of meaning. So I think you're right as to what I'm saying. I think that Husserl is just trying to get us to see that the natural attitude is a concealing of a much more original relationship with the world. And that's not to say that the natural attitude is a reduction. The natural attitude is a concealing of an original relation for the purposes of mathematizing and making more predictable what our life is like. So we need to measure out land, which is inherently bumpy. And so we begin to find, that mathematizing land with straight lines would provide for good borders between my land and your land, right? And so he talks about this in the Origin of Geometry. But I think what you point to is that phenomenology, and this has been criticized a lot, people criticize phenomenology for this a lot, is a return to absolute beginnings. And the absolute beginning of consciousness is in the paradox of being in the world and being conscious of the world all the time. So the notion of the world as separable and as able to receive mathematical processes from me, that's derivative of some much more powerful, intimate relationship. So anyway.
I have one comment on the epoche itself. How do you do it? I understand that it's not doubt, and I understand why it's not doubt. But how do you actually apply these parentheses? I've had students, you try to explain metacognition. I want you to report to me every time you're thinking about having a cigarette. And they say, well, how am I supposed to do that? I have no answer. I don't know what to say at that point. How do you bracket? How do you stop making the judgment? What's the process?
One way that he kind of talks about that I find helpful is, if you think about what life is usually like, we're usually trying to do something or trying to find out if something is true. Is the sun going to rise? What's the weather going to be? Anything like that in the world. That's a kind of thing we do. I have to go shopping. I have to find out if there are termites in the house, for example, or things like that. And one thought I find helpful that I think he does talk about is, okay, let's say we disengage from that question as such. Then what's left? So normally we're involved with one question or another about what is in the world. What is the case in the world? And there are many different acts, and that's what we're doing all the time. But he says we can disengage with that as such in one blow, and then something is left. I don't know. That's one thing that I find helpful, but that's one way to think about it.
Yeah,
So
I wonder if I could try to answer Bill Adams' question at a risk of sounding inauthentic somehow. But the shortest answer I can give you, Bill, is you begin with your breath. You begin with your breath, and your breath, if you focusing, attending to breath, you can slow down and quiet the narratives. And the problems are the narratives that are otherwise inescapable. Of course, what I'm doing is just mindfulness. And so I don't want to pretend to be an expert. But I'm pretty sure that the starting place, how do you begin, I think was your question. And I think, for me anyway, the answer is you begin by paying attention to your breath, and experience develops this. That's quite an amazing thing to do.
Can I just interject? I liken it to the self-emptying process of meditation. I mean, you're just like completely like erasing everything, self-emptying and quiet too, like what you said, Gordon. So.
Can I get in there just in terms of just because two concepts that I think are maybe helpful here, like at the beginning and the end of the section we're just looking at. One is horizon and the other is complete freedom. Where he talks about world, he talks about horizon, he talks about the infinity and the indeterminateness of horizon. And of course, Husserl will go on to talk about an inner and an external horizon, right? And that's something that we exclude in our natural attitude, right? Because I cannot do anything if I'm conscious of the infinity of the horizons of the thing. I have to limit myself to a certain horizon in order to practically engage. And to me, when he talks about complete freedom, that's what he's getting at, right? I mean, I never have complete freedom in the world because I'm always constrained to certain interests or practical concerns or whatever the case may be. And so the complete freedom is a way of disengaging. And I think that's what the epoche allows us to do. It allows us to disengage from that and then allow that infinity to appear. And to me, those are correlative terms here.
I have one last question, follow up on what Peter had said. So I'm wondering, is Husserl committed to some kind of natural kinds?
Can you say more about what you mean, Bill?
Well, maybe trees are natural kinds. It's not really clear to me, but it's a long-standing concept in the physics, in natural sciences, some notion of natural kinds. Of course, these things have to be worked out, what exactly these kinds are. But the point is that I don't know what more to say about them. They are, there are somehow or other that we can distinguish objects. I don't know, physics majors in this. I'm a physicist, but I don't know much more to say about natural kinds. But there are rivers, and what makes things. I don't know. The idea, if there were such things as natural kinds, then I can easily imagine that somehow or other the essences. Once I'm no longer a child. I grow up. I get to learn these natural kinds. I get to recognize them. Then I can see that more clearly because I understand this idea of the essences of these natural kinds are being self-expressed all the time. I just don't particularly pick up on them. And as I get older, and even as we learn more about the world, things show up. But so I don't know if Husserl ever uses that term. It's certainly an old term. It's not a new one.
I don't know if he uses the term, but I can say this. I think that what you're getting in Ideas 1 and a lot of his other works are what he calls modes of intuition. And by marking out the manners of givenness and the modes of intuition, he can do something that allows people to be able to make progress from sort of certain touchstones to less certain ones by virtue of the fact that the object's givenness and my response to it are given together. So I'm going to use the word probably badly, but there is a natural kind of intuition called memory. There is a natural kind called essential intuition. There's a natural kind called expectation. There's a natural kind called perception. Those are already different ways of accepting, appropriating, intertwining with the givenness of various objects. There's also, as we would see in further sections, like the ability to see something as valuable or as beautiful or whatever. And so there's sort of, if you will, pre-given ways of relating to objects and pre-given dispositions towards seeing things in certain ways. So I think there might be some connection there. But I also think that because consciousness is intertwined with world and with object, the object has to tell us how to perceive it and participates in the way in which we see it as. And so there are no pre-existing categories or pre-existing kinds, as if we were in the natural attitude and we believed that the world was independent of us and could show us what it was organized to be. So, and this is why I think, to go back to the earlier question, the epoché is so difficult to do as an experience. He says we could do it all at once and bracket our participation in the ontological prejudice all at once. But I only find that I can get a handle on it in particular instances. For example, I find it easier to bracket the last 70 years of Husserl scholarship and to read a book for what it says to me, right? Or any kind of scholarship. I find it easier to do that than to bracket the existence of the world. I find it easier to recognize at moments of conflict, primarily, that my relationship with other people is situating me as something that I'm involved with that I don't get to determine as something completely separate from me. So if I break up with someone and then I pass them in the street and I feel tugged back to them or something, we might see the relationship as some third term, me and the other person and the relationship. And by way of that, we might say the relationship has its plans for me. So I can see that notion of relationship as a third term that situates myself and the other person as single moments within it. I can see that as somehow, to go back to Randy's point of Webb, like a metaphor for what happens when I perform the epoché. I begin to see the overarching relationship of experience as such, which includes subject and object, as situating us. And that's when I feel like I've done the epoché. Anyway.
So I just got to follow that up a little. So I don't know how to say this. So my sense is that, and I can believe this, is that what Husserl is after, what he can even be possibly after, is a human-specific eidos, a human-specific eidos of experience. And there may be, I mean, this makes it the universal part, that there could be very well, barring transhumanism, maybe transhumanism is going to change our eidos, but that there is a human-specific eidos for all experience, and that's what the objective of phenomenology is after. Does that make any sense?
It does make some sense. I'll say something quickly, and then probably we should end, because I know that people have to go on. I'll stay for a little while if anyone would like to talk individually. I have another about 15 minutes, and we can leave the rest, and I'll send an update as to how much further to read. Husserl's pretty clear that he's not talking about a human-specific eidos of consciousness. And the reason that he's talking about that is not necessarily to leave room for God. In section 43, he's basically saying that it is the way in which objects appear that show that any perception of objects must necessarily do what it is that we do. That if an object presents itself as one side at a time that requires me to walk around it to see the sides that are not in view, there is no possibility of that object appearing in that way and then having some other way of appearing to some other kind of consciousness. So I guess we rest secure. It's not because we're human that we have this consciousness necessarily, although Sally's point about embodiment is really important. But like, there is no conceivable way in which the method of appearing that objects show could be paired with anything but the kind of unification of consciousness that we call the cogito, or that we call the response to adumbrations or whatever. And so he both wants to say, look, the object clarifies the structure of our consciousness, and the object clarifies the structure of any consciousness as such that would be consciousness of it. And this is why, and I'll end with this as a kind of religious point, since we are the phenomenology religious experience, this is why I believe, without having read it, Olga's read much more than me about religion, but I believe this is why Husserl converted. Without knowing anything, I think it's why he converted from Judaism to Christianity to Lutheranism. Because in Christianity, God became human. Therefore, God perceived all of the human world in the ways that human beings did, linking, therefore, any notion of divinity with humanity, and therefore saying that consciousness is all one. So if I take Husserl to be consistent, then it would mean that he saw something in that, which I'm not saying that Judaism is bad or anything like that. I'm just saying I think that he was utterly consistent in thinking that if there is a divinity, that divinity, whatever divinity is, if there is an animal, whatever that animal's consciousness is, if there's something else, angels, whatever it is, they have to experience the world in the same structural ways that we do. So anyway, I really appreciate all of your time. I hope that you would send me feedback if you don't like something, or if you do like something, or if you want to continue in a certain way. Please feel free to do this. Like I'm not getting paid for this, right? So my goal is to be responsive to what the group wants, and I just hope that maybe some of the things that I said and some of the things that each of us has said together will be something that keeps you thinking during the time in between. I would say right now, before I send something out and talk with any of you, I would say that we would continue reading up until about section 69, which goes back towards the intuition of essences, which we really are never leaving from in this whole book. So I would just say we'll start with section 33 and we'll go up until about 157 for next time. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate being with you. I'll stay for a little while if anyone has anything else they'd like to say, but take care.
I for one am happy to stick around for a moment. I really appreciate, you providing this opportunity to meditate on these things.
Sure, I have about 10 minutes, so please feel free to say whatever, any of you, to say whatever is on your mind or whatever.
I'm not totally sure what I think of it, but that's a really interesting idea about Christianity and what may have been behind his conversion. I just like to mention, I think that's really interesting. It's something I never thought of before. And I also agree that there is that all of this does have religious implications, and that can be developed in lots of different ways. And there are the late volume of Grundprobleme, where he actually, probably several people are familiar with, that he does barely start to develop some of the theological ideas. And interestingly, there he says, perhaps some are aware, he actually says that this has always was his ambition for phenomenology, to develop theology and metaphysics on its basis, but there was just so much to do to lay the groundwork that he never got around to it. So I think that I just like to mention that, because especially in relation to, obviously to religious experience.
Yeah, certainly in section 58, page 134 of our text, 133 to 134, he's talking about these different transcendencies, like that transcendency of the world, which has been thematic, but then as well a yet different, still different transcendency of God. So I mean, there I think, and Jim Hart highlighted this as well, and it gives this marvelous teleology, he says. I mean, there I think it's very clear already where he wants to go, from that theme, but also I think just generally the whole overall aim of science as scientia universalis, thesis universalis, that drive to this universality is already very clearly both wanting to go to the foundation and the frontier of consciousness and consciousness of the world, and therefore of the world, or of real existence, and the reality of such topics as the soul and God. And once again, that stuff we were talking about earlier, the stuff I was bringing up early on, I do think maybe at least for Husserl, there is a tendency to see the asymmetry of these two types of things as we need to establish this noetic framework and foundation before we can go on to the noematic. I don't think that's how it has to happen, but I think that's generally how Husserl is doing it. I'm curious if other people are perceiving this as well. I mean, I think it's evident in certain things, but it's not necessarily the case, since he has so many different beginnings.
What are you asking again?
Like whether he is really starting with like the noetic or the cognitive in the Cartesian sense, apodictic certainty, which is an epistemological thing about knowing, before using that to get at the being of the world and the contents of consciousness as transcendent realities.
I think where he's going is the inseparability of the two.
But first,
not starting with one or the other. I think that's kind of the whole idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an a priori synthesis of these things, but analysis itself, science itself, dictates a hypothetical separation of the two sides, however they might appear. It could just be analysis and synthesis itself, but I think it appears in different ways. We have to make a separation, take ourselves out of the ocean, and then and then we can determine things, and then we can plunge back in, or we can see that the ocean is also over here, and that's like how we are moving about through this activity, the agency, which is, the onus is on us. We have agency to move cognitively, like an icebreaker, breaking path, like Lucifer, that knowledge principle through the cosmos, through outer space, breaking paths, making these noetic tracings, and then being able to see the heavens in all their color and quality. I mean, I think that's, what analysis fundamentally is it's this cognitive activity, and it's present in dialectical activity, and it's about making distinctions. And yes, we do that so that we can also see the way of synthesis. So I mean, I do think like it's not like I'm not trying to argue it's like about making a dualism or something, but that's how knowledge works, or science. It's premised on this form, this analytic form of distinction.
I'm not quite sure what to say really, but it could be that what he's talking about kind of gets beyond that. It's not science in that. And we're trying to get it. I think this is also what Peter's talking about. There's some concept we can derive about what is at the heart of this. And Peter's using the terms inseparability of subject and object. How do we get to that kind of idea? And what's going on there? Yeah.
I mean, he does talk about both this idea of swimming, Randy, to go back with the ocean thing you just said, but it's for very short moments, swimming along with our own memory, our own perception of consciousness as it's happening. And because we can only do it for very short bursts or very short moments, what he ends up trying to say is that we have to have a dual way of describing everything. So we're limited to a zigzag, and we're limited to, but they're parallel and they require one another, a noetic description and a noematic description. So I think that's the inherent infinity of phenomenology, is always saying that the object has to set the terms for the description. And so since, as you said, science is about us bringing tools to experience and sort of articulating experience in terms of those tools, we are always going to be revising based on what we do. But the revising that we do is continuously reminding ourselves of our commitment to the reduction and the epoche. And that means working together in such a way, this is why I think it's inherently democratic, working together in such a way to say, what is given to me may not be given to you. And that's why I need to listen to you, because you're seeing this text or you're seeing this book from another point of view that I could only operate if I were able to inhabit your life, which I am not able to do. And so therefore, all of the descriptions come as potentially intertwined together. So this is a communal science where the investigators are not simply replaceable. It is not true that as it would be in physics or chemistry, that we should be mere placeholders for insights. It's rather that the insights that accrue do so on the basis of historical and genetic features that are proper to each of us, but that which get included through this basic remembering that we're not in charge. None of us individually and none of us at all are in charge of a meaning that begins with an upsurge, right? Which begins with, as you said, Jeremy, this kind of togetherness. So I don't quite know either how to respond, except to say, I think this is a new way of understanding science. And I think this is a new way of really trying to get away from what he sees as the dislocation between us and one another, and between us and the world, and between us and the object. That's why the crisis of the European sciences is a crisis, because we're about to create things that destroy the earth, destroy the world. And we do that because we take seriously the vision of science that you well articulated, Randy, which is that we bring cognition to things. Anyway, I'm sorry that I have to leave. I really like the discussion. I appreciate both of you very much. And I hope that you'll send me suggestions. I will be sending the sections to focus on pretty soon.
And I just want to say I don't think that I'm not the cause of the crisis. I think it's the arithmetization of geometry. So it is a certain form of the mathematization of nature. And so, like, I'm not a representative of first order or classical science. You know, I'm all for Husserlian scientific philosophy, you know, pure phenomenology and its continuing development. You know, just so there's no confusion.
No, I got that. I didn't mean to imply that either. So thank you. All right. I'll see you all.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.